Okay, well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight for our latest edition of Let's Talk About Hanford, which is a conversation about compliance at Hanford and how ecology helps oversee the safe storage and handling of waste on the Hanford site. I am Ginger Wireman. I'm a community outreach and environmental education specialist for the Department of Ecology's nuclear waste program. This is my 21st year. I'll be full 21 years in October. And I normally do outreach and education in person, but during COVID we couldn't. So we came up with this as a way to kind of expand our outreach. And also it allows us to share a bunch of different topics that I wouldn't be able to speak to because I don't have that particular expertise. With me tonight is our colleague Dana McFadden. She's the person behind the curtain. You won't see her, but she's the one keeping things operating and moving slides and stuff. And Ryan Miller, who's the head of our communications program, and he's going to go over some housekeeping items, and then we will introduce our speakers.
Awesome. Thank you, Ginger, and thanks everybody for your patience as we work through some minor social media issues today. Welcome. Today our event is themed Let's Talk About Hanford Compliance. We have some fantastic speakers lined up today, and we'll introduce them here in a second. But of course, I want to go over our typical housekeeping kind of materials. So at any time in tonight's event, if you're on the Zoom chat, you can feel free to put in any questions or comments you have into the chat box on Zoom. And if you have any questions that you put into Zoom, we'll ask them live during the Q&A session after the presentation. If you're on the Facebook live stream version, again, you can feel free to put any questions or comments you have at any time. If there are questions, we'll take them during the Q&A session. So feel free just to drop those into the chat box on either Zoom or Facebook if you have anything at all tonight. So again, the structure of tonight's event is like our previous ones, where we're going to go and do a presentation, where this one's going to be on ecology's compliance role at Hanford, and then we're going to go into a live Q&A with John Price, Kathy Conway, and Jared Matthew. Excuse me, sorry. So we'll do our best to answer any questions you guys have tonight. But if we get any questions that are off topic, off the topic of compliance, we'll probably have to defer your questions to a future event, or we can, take your question offline and answer them that way, just because the experts we have on tonight are geared specifically towards this compliance topic. So we do encourage you to please keep your questions on topic. But with that being said, again, feel free to put your questions and comments anytime into the chat. Again, thank you for joining tonight's event, and I'll go ahead and kick it over to Ginger to introduce our speakers tonight.
Great. So tonight, our main speaker will be John Price, who oversees our compliance team and has been with ecology for quite some time. I'll let him introduce himself a little further. And then two of our inspectors, Jared Matthew and Kathy Conway. And do we have closed captions on? Anyway, so we'll have John Price and then Jared Matthew and Kathy Conway, who are some of our inspectors, will be able to help with answering questions. And John, go ahead and take it away. And Dana.
Yeah, thank you, Ginger. So I'm John Price. My title is Tri-Party Agreement Section Manager. I supervise the compliance inspectors with the Ecology Nuclear Waste Program. I've been with Ecology almost 22 years, and I've been in my current position for about 13 years. And I'll pass the mic over to Jared.
Hi, my name is Jared Matthew. I'm a compliance project manager with Nuclear Waste Program. Been with Ecology for about 19 and a half years, about 9.5 years with the Air Quality Program, and 10 years with the Nuclear Waste Program. Kathy?
Hi, I'm Kathy Conway, and I've been with the Nuclear Waste Program with Ecology for about 23 years. I started in compliance. I switched over a while in permitting and then back into compliance, and one of the leads for the program.
Excellent. Well, with that, we can probably go ahead and get started with our presentation for the night. Dana, did you want to pull up the slides again? And we can go ahead and Don can pick slides.
Okay, Dana, why don't you go to slide number 2? Let's go to slide number 3, I guess that, or slide number 2. There we go. Okay, before we talk about compliance, I want to give you just a brief introduction to the subject of hazardous waste, because we're going to talk about compliance with hazardous waste regulations. So there's a federal law called the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, and we'll refer to that as RCRA throughout tonight just to make it a little quicker. Requires managing hazardous waste from cradle to grave. What do we mean from cradle to grave? So when hazardous wastes are generated, that's called the cradle, and when they're appropriately treated or disposed of, that's a grave. That's the grave. So what do I mean by generated? So a good example is if you think about the batteries in your flashlight, those are not a waste when you're using them. They're what we call a product. But when they run out of charge, and then they become a waste and they have to be managed appropriately. That's just a very simplistic example. So businesses and government locations, which we call facilities that treat, store, and dispose of hazardous waste, must have RCRA permits for those activities. Most Hanford hazardous waste is also radioactive. We call that mixed waste. There are millions of gallons of mixed waste in tanks at Hanford and thousands of containers of mixed waste in drums and boxes. Next slide, please, Dana. Okay, so I referred to a federal law, RCRA. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency authorizes states like Washington to carry out the RCRA requirements in their states. Each year, EPA and Ecology agree to a performance partnership agreement. That's like a contract between Ecology and EPA to manage the RCRA permits throughout the state and inspect facilities throughout the state. EPA says compliance inspections are a key way that EPA and its state partners like Ecology make sure that the regulated community obeys environmental laws and regulations. Next slide. Okay, so I mentioned the Performance Partnership Agreement as a contract. What are Ecology's inspection commitments for Hanford? EPA requires what's called an annual compliance evaluation inspection for federal facilities like Hanford. And I'll tell you a little bit more about a compliance evaluation inspection in another slide. Ecology inspection reports on each of 35 to 40 permitted units at Hanford. The single shell tanks at Hanford, which you may have heard of, are just a single inspection. So 149 tanks are one of those permitted units. Besides permitted units, EPA also recognizes waste generators. You can think of those as things like businesses that are not required to have a permit. Statewide, Ecology is required to annually inspect the 20% of the 500 what are called large quantity generators, so the bigger generators of hazardous waste. Hanford is also a large quantity generator in addition to a permitted facility. So besides the 35 to 40 permitted units that we inspect each year, we also annually inspect 20% of Hanford's 70 central accumulation areas. Those are generator locations. Go ahead and go to the next slide, Dana. Okay, so I'll try and mix it up a little bit with pictures so you don't just have to stare at the words on the screen. So these are examples of waste accumulation areas on the Hanford site. So you might go out on the Hanford site if you're an inspector and see just a couple of drums, and those are appropriately marked, and we go out and look and make sure that the right labels are on those and check some other things as well. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So I said I'd tell you what a compliance evaluation inspection is. Ecology is required to do one of those types of inspections at Hanford each and every year. So EPA defines that as a review of a facility records and files and looking at previous inspection reports to look for things like previous problems and see if those have been corrected or have occurred again. A CEI requires Ecology to go on site at Hanford to evaluate those treatment, storage, or disposal areas. We look at things like maintenance records, sampling records for waste and other things. We can look at financial records at businesses, not so much at Hanford, and we also look at administrative records. Administrative records might be things like the training records for individuals that manage hazardous waste. And generally, EPA says a CEI is an evaluation of whether a facility's hazardous waste management practices are in compliance with the RCRA requirements and the requirements of the authorized state program. Go ahead and go to the next slide if you would, Dana. So this is an example of one of the facilities out at Hanford. This is called the Integrated Disposal Facility. And when the Hanford Low Activity Waste Treatment Facility starts up, hopefully in September of next year, and starts treating tank waste, the tank waste will be vitrified or turned into glass and inside of stainless steel cylinders, and those cylinders will be disposed of in this landfill. So that doesn't look like much to inspect on the left-hand picture. If you look on the right-hand side, you can see a pipe going into the ground, and that's for the purposes of looking at secondary leak detection. So a landfill like this has a liner, and then it has another liner below that liner with the ability to check for leaks in between. So that's one of the safety provisions of RCRA is to double line landfills. Go ahead and go to the next slide. Hanford inspections are really challenging for our inspectors. So if you think about the previous slide with the landfill, the integrated disposal facility, Hanford has the only permitted RCRA landfills in the state of Washington. And we not only have the integrated disposal facility, we have several permitted landfills. The permitted units at Hanford may have waste streams, that's types of waste that are unique to Washington, or may even be one of a kind for the entire United States. So our inspectors have to know things and look at things that inspectors throughout the country or throughout Washington don't have to look at. Another big challenge for our inspectors is the permitted units at Hanford are much larger than other Washington permitted facilities. Certainly industries and that manufacture things can be quite complicated elsewhere in the state, but our RCRA activities at Hanford are generally quite a bit larger or are larger than elsewhere in the state. As an example, the Hanford Central Waste Complex, which is one of the units that we inspect, and I'll show you a picture in a little bit, manages over 10,000 containers, and those containers could be in the Central Waste Complex for decades, whereas a commercial facility might have just a few hundreds of drums and would have those drums in the facility for less than a year. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So here's a comparison of the Hanford Central Waste Complex on the left and a commercial treatment storage disposal facility on the right. So on the left, you see the Central Waste Complex, and there are about 43 buildings and structures where waste is managed there. So that's quite a lot for our inspectors to evaluate. And the facility on the right, which is a commercial facility, might just have a few large buildings and a few smaller buildings. So that's a comparison of some of our challenges. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So one of the things we want to make sure is that we have quality inspections at the Hanford site. So there's some things we do to make sure that we have quality inspections. There are 3 ecology programs out of 10 total programs that do RCRA inspections. And we have a 3-program memorandum of agreement between the Ecology Nuclear Waste Program and those other 2 programs. So all 3 programs use the same manual for inspectors. We do common training, and we also use the same enforcement process. So that consistency helps make sure that we have quality inspections. One of the other things we do is when we train new inspectors at the Nuclear Waste Program, we have them participate in inspections by other ecology offices so that they get kind of a calibration or understanding of what the norm is for doing inspections elsewhere in the state. So we try and inspect Hanford the same as much as we can as we would inspect other facilities in the state. And then EPA comes in every 2 years and they do what's called a state review framework, where they evaluate our 3 programs' compliance implementation versus EPA's standards for inspections and compliance. Go ahead and go to the next slide, please, Dana. Our inspectors like Kathy and Jared are responsible to write and sign their inspection reports. So those inspection reports are basically issued by them, not by me as their manager. And they are also responsible to resolve any compliance issues that they identify in the report. And before they sign, they make sure that each of their reports undergoes rigorous review. So they have a support inspector that goes out on their inspections with them to do things like take notes and take photographs. And those support inspectors, since they were on the inspection, provide a peer review of the report. Kathy Conaway, who's our program compliance lead, reviews each and every report and makes comments. If there's a particularly complex or controversial report, they will consult with me and have me consult on exactly how they're looking at the violations or resolution of violations. We often have attorneys review either an entire report or maybe part of a report that we need some help with. And we also make sure that each report goes through a technical editing review so that it's readable when we send it over to the Hanford site. Go ahead and go to the next slide, please. So earlier I showed you a slide with an aerial view of the Central Waste Complex, and this is a view inside a couple of the buildings at the Central Waste Complex. So one of the things our inspectors do is go into those buildings and they look at waste containers like these and make sure they're appropriately labeled and that they're in good condition, and they look for lots of other things. So this is an example of some of the things that we inspect. Go ahead and go to the next slide, please. So I've been talking a little bit about compliance and enforcement. So enforcement is part of our compliance program. The EPA oversight of state authorized programs like Ecology's requires consistent application of enforcement. And Ecology and EPA both use a three-tier approach, kind of a progressive approach to compliance. First, we always seek voluntary compliance, including providing technical assistance to any facility that we inspect to try and help them understand what their problems are and help them understand how they might remedy those problems. Secondly, if we don't see a good response through voluntary compliance, then we'll proceed to what's called informal enforcement. And then finally, if informal enforcement doesn't develop a correction for the problems that we note, then we'll go to formal enforcement. And that's actually required of us when the facility doesn't return to compliance within what we think is an achievable or reasonable time frame. Okay, Dana, next slide, please. So what is formal enforcement? Formal enforcement includes an order to correct a violation, and it may also include penalties. The tri-party agreement, which you may have heard of for the Hanford site, is properly called the Hanford Federal Facility Agreement and Consent Order. So the last part of that title means it is an order. So we can use the tri-party agreement when we want to do formal enforcement at the Hanford site. The tri-party agreement also allows Ecology to issue orders outside of the TPA for tri-party agreement related issues, but we have independent authority to issue orders for any issues that are related to the Hanford permit or waste generator activities at the Hanford site. Go ahead and go to the next slide, please. So this is another of the units at Hanford that we inspect. This is the 242-A evaporator, and this evaporator takes single shell or double shell tank waste, I should say, and evaporates it to concentrate it down. And so you can see in the pictures in the middle and the right, it's quite a complicated industrial facility. So this is the sort of thing that our inspectors have to go out and evaluate. So it is quite a challenge for our inspectors. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So violations. Inspection reports may identify violations of permit conditions and regulations. We can also identify what are called concerns. So we may, our inspectors may see something that they think could develop into a problem and could become a violation if it's not corrected. So our reports can identify both concerns that we'd like to see addressed, and we can also identify violations for which there needs to be a correction done. Every violation requires both a correction and a return to compliance date. So it's understandable there's going to be problems, but problems have to have a fix and they have to have a schedule to get fixed. Our compliance inspectors coordinate within the nuclear waste program with people that don't work on compliance. That would be staff like permit writers and project managers for those units. And they work with those non-compliant staff to develop what are implementable or achievable corrective actions and reasonable timeframes for correcting problems. Our individual inspectors are accountable to enter violations and return to compliance dates into the National EPA RCRA Info database. So EPA checks RCRA compliance across the country, and they look at our violations and violations that other states identify and track and make sure that we're getting those corrected and getting them corrected in a reasonable time frame. One of the things that EPA looks at also is making sure that we have complete and quality data entry so that they can understand what the violations are, and that they can understand the violations are appropriately identified. Go ahead and go to the next slide, please. So a question that we get sometimes is, why do we issue penalties at the Hanford site, and doesn't that take money away from cleanup? That's a quote of things that we get asked sometimes. Well, one of the reasons we issue penalties at the Hanford site is that consistent application of penalties is one of the things that EPA evaluates for EPA authorized state RCRA programs. So they're looking for consistent compliance programs, and so application of penalties when appropriate is one of the things that they look at. Now, that said, unlike commercial facilities where penalties are taken away from their profits, penalties for federal facilities like Hanford don't create a profit-based incentive to change. We certainly recognize that, but we also allow in the tri-party agreement penalties issued through the tri-party agreement to be more lenient than RCRA penalties. So in the RCRA arena and in state regulations, the allowance is that each individual violation can be penalized up to $10,000 per day. That's $10,000 per day per violation is the RCRA norm for, or the RCRA maximum for penalties, whereas the tri-party agreement has kind of ratcheted that back to $10,000 per week. So the tri-party agreement does allow for some leniency for Hanford. Go ahead and go to the next slide. I mentioned the state review framework earlier, so that's one of the ways that EPA makes sure that we have quality and consistent programs. What do they look at? So they go into the RCRA info database and also into the records that we keep at Ecology, and they make sure that our data is complete, accurate, and that we put data into the database in a timely manner. They look at whether our performance partnership agreement commitments are met. Did we do the number of inspections that we said we would do? Did we do quality inspection reports? And are we getting our reports done in a timely manner? As I mentioned earlier, EPA also looks at violations. They look at whether we've identified violations appropriately. They look at whether we've identified what's called significant non-compliance, and they also look at the accuracy of our compliance determinations. And I mentioned formal enforcement earlier. So EPA in their state review framework looks at the timeliness and appropriateness of formal enforcement, and they look at whether we're getting facilities returned, like Hanford, returned to compliance. And then finally, I mentioned penalties earlier, and EPA will evaluate our calculation of penalties where we consider things like the gravity of the violations that we identify and whether or not there's been economic benefit to the facility by means of the facility being non-compliant. And they also look at whether we're collecting penalties. Go ahead and go to the next slide, Dana. So this is one more example of one of the interesting and unique facilities that we inspect at Hanford, and represents one of the challenges to our inspectors. So this is the waste encapsulation storage facility where capsules of cesium and strontium that were extracted from the Hanford tank waste are stored. And normally when we go out on an inspection, we would look at individual containers and look at the whether the containers are in good condition. We would look at things like the labeling of the containers, as I talked about earlier. Well, in this case, the waste containers are stored below water because of the high amount of radiation. And so our inspectors can't go down underwater and look at those containers, perhaps obviously. And this is an interesting facility. You can see on the right that the the water, it actually has a blue glow to it, and that's called Cherenkov radiation, which occurs when beta radiation particles travel through water at a speed faster than the speed of light in water. So this is one of the, again, one of the interesting and unique facilities that we look at Hanford. Go ahead and go to the next slide, please. Okay, so just in summary, how do ecology inspections benefit US DOE and its contractors? The RCRA regulations are intended to prevent hazardous waste from impacting workers, the public, and the environment. So they're a preventative measure. Preventing hazards is perhaps obviously less expensive than responding to problems. As I said earlier, our inspections strive to identify corrective actions that US DOE can implement on an achievable time frame. Our inspectors are specially trained to evaluate RCRA compliance. So they have a special expertise that they can apply in evaluating potential problems at the Hanford site. And then finally, our inspectors work with our permitting staff to help improve the permit and help keep cleanup moving at the Hanford site. And I think that's it. Dane, you want to go to the last slide? And I'll turn it back to our facilitator.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, John. So I want to thank you and Kathy and Jared again all for hopping on, and we're going to move into our question and answer session. I said this earlier, but if anybody has any questions, at any time, you can feel free to jump into the chat, ask your question. If you're on the Zoom stream specifically, you also have the option to unmute and turn on your camera, and you can ask your question that way as well. I'm going into the settings right now just to allow folks to turn on their video and to unmute themselves. So I know we can wait a minute if anybody wants to hop on the Zoom question. We have a couple of questions on Facebook. Our first question on Facebook came from Susan Leckband, and Susan asked, does Ecology believe that they have adequate access to the units it should be inspecting and that Ecology should increase its inspections? Also, are inspection results available publicly?
Yeah, can you repeat the question one more time? That's actually two questions, so I want to make sure I get it.
I'll tell you what, I'll ask you the first one first, then we'll go to the
Okay.
second. So Susan asked, does Ecology believe that they have adequate access to the units it should be inspecting and that Ecology should increase its inspections?
And should Ecology increase its inspections? So as I mentioned earlier, we have a performance partnership agreement that requires us to inspect each of those facilities, the 35 to 40 units each and every year. So I believe we have adequate access to do that. And then did I catch all that question?
Yeah, and then the second part of the question was also, are inspection results available publicly?
They are available publicly, and I think there's a couple of ways that the public can see those. One is we transmit our inspection reports by letter to the Department of Energy, and they should be available in the Hanford Administrative Record and Public Information Repository. And then the other way they can have access to them is we do keep copies of them in our Public Records Center here at Ecology.
Awesome, thanks, John. And I'll make a quick note that I forgot to say this earlier on, but as per all of our events that we've held for this Let's Talk About Hanford, this event is being recorded, and I will upload it to YouTube tomorrow after the event, and it's also going to be available up on our Facebook page. And we're also going to put up the slideshow on our website, and so we'll send out a notification when all that's set up tomorrow, just so everybody's aware that you can rewatch this stream, tomorrow onward if you wish. Ginger, do you see any questions?
Yeah, I have a question kind of related, a follow-up to Susan's question. So if you do 30 to 40 inspections a year, how many units do we regulate total, and what would the cycle of visits be like between inspections? Or do you have some that you visit more frequently than, how do you decide which ones?
Yeah, Jared does our scheduling. Do you want to answer that one, Jared?
Sure. Yeah. So we do inspections of all the facilities every year. We do different types of inspections for different types of units. So for operating units, we're going to those on-site inspection every year. We do what's called operation and maintenance inspection, which is a groundwater monitoring inspection. These are for closure units that are going to be closing. And then we also have NRRs for other closure units, which is what's called a non-financial records review. And those are just pulling records and doing them. We only do a handful of those every year. And then every 5 years, we go on, have to do a full-on on-site inspection with those units.
Thanks, Jared. Another question we have on Facebook, and then we'll ask if anybody wants to turn on their cameras on the Zoom call. This question came from Dan Solitz, and Dan asked, how are inspectors trained at Ecology?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. Kathy, do you want to answer that, or do you want Jared or me to answer that?
I think she's trying to unmute. There you are.
I want Jared to answer it.
So we follow, we have a inspector training that we work together, like John was talking about with the 3 programs together. We work on the common training program. And so it's a combination of a lessons guide that you go through and have to complete and document. There's also on-the-job training where you have to go out and do a certain number of inspections. You also have to do a certain number of leads, certain number of supports. And then there's also classroom training where we have to go do classroom training, which is just required, like HAZWOPER, and then our ecology standard trainings that we have as well.
And I'll just add to that. Oh, go ahead, Kathy.
Okay, thanks. I didn't want Jared to forget the inspector toolbox and how valuable and how that is part of our training as well. He's a team member on that. It's a very robust training that we do. It could take up to 6 months to do a training for a dangerous waste inspector. So it's no easy, it's not simple or easy. We take it very seriously, and we consider them to be quite trained when we let them out the chute.
Thank you, everybody. So on the Zoom chat, do we have anybody on our Zoom call today that wants to turn on the camera, unmute, and ask any questions they have? And feel free just to go ahead and turn your camera on, and I'll take that as a cue to ask you a question.
It looks like Michael Patterson has a question.
Oh, perfect. Michael asked in the chat, how does RCRA interact with Washington's Hazardous Waste Management Act? Is there a requirement under RCRA for Hanford to self-report any violations?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and start on that, and Jared or Kathy may want to chime in. So when EPA authorizes our state program, they get what's called an authorization package from the Department of Ecology. And their key metric is they want to make sure that our regulations are at least as stringent as the federal regulations. Our regulations can be more stringent, but they have to be at least as stringent for the federal regulations. I believe they have to look at that authorization every so number of years. Kathy or Jared might know how many years that is. I don't know about a requirement under RCRA for Hanford to self-report any violations, but we do have a requirement in the Hanford permit for the Department of Energy to turn in an annual kind of assessment of any non-compliances they found. And did Jared or Kathy?
Yeah, that permit condition requires annual report that is a self-reporting mechanism. And I believe they're also required, aren't they required to, if they don't, they can notify us. Of course, you know, there's the spills and everything that they must notify us and put in their operating record, self-reporting. Jared?
Yeah, so we're an authorized program, and so that's done through rulemaking. And so we have the dangerous waste regulations, which is how we're authorized to implement RCRA. And it can be it can be equally or more stringent than RCRA. And in most cases, the state is more stringent than the federal RCRA regulations.
Yeah, and one more thing on self-reporting any violations. I'll take you way back in time, Kathy, but you remember there is a type of inspection called facility self-identification or something like that. And you remember we had an issue with waste in the plutonium finishing plant, and the contractor reported it to us, and they told us what their corrective action and their schedule would be. And we just put that in our database and followed up a year later, and they corrected it. And that makes things easy for both of us.
Yeah. doesn't happen. We don't, it doesn't happen as often as maybe it should, but there are mechanisms in place for self-reporting.
Awesome. Well, I want to give another chance. If anybody wants to unmute and turn on the camera and ask a question, you're more than free to now. I have a question I can ask for Facebook, but I want to give a chance for folks on the Zoom chat to turn on the cameras if you want to ask a question. But if not, I could have to go to Facebook. So I'm not seeing any cameras or messages in the Zoom chat. So I'll go ahead and I do see a Zoom question that came in, but we'll ask this Facebook one first. Susan asked on Facebook again, does DOE at Hanford inform ecology and EPA immediately when a confirmed or potential regulated contaminant is leaked to the environment?
I didn't quite hear that. Can
Yeah,
we
yep.
have it repeated?
Let me ask it again. Does DOE at Hanford inform ecology and EPA immediately when a confirmed or potential RCRA-related contaminant is leaked to the environment? And I could put this question into the Zoom chat as well, so you can do it.
That is a requirement they must do. Anything that has been put into the environment, they must notify us immediately.
Yeah, and so what, follow up on that a little bit. So like a lot of times, you know, they have with RCRA permitted facilities, they have what's called a contingency plan. So if something like that were to happen, they're required to implement their contingency plan. So their first actions are really just to work on setting up all the setups for emergency response on that. After they get it, part of that setup process is notifying.
Yeah, and there's also a 24-hour hotline that Ecology maintains, and DOE can report incidents on that 24-hour hotline, and then we get reports out of that that our inspectors can follow up on.
Yes, that's correct. Is there a question from Glenn about communication?
Yeah. What means of communication is set up for complaints that come in from whistleblowers?
Well, that's an interesting question. And the last whistleblower complaint that I worked that we had to do with some leaky drums at RAP and CWC, and it turned into a 2-year investigation and a agreed order. John?
Yeah, so we do occasionally get anonymous complaints. I don't know that we've gotten any what I would call whistleblower complaints, but we do occasionally get anonymous complaints, and so we'll evaluate those, and in some cases we'll follow up with an inspection, and in some cases, as Kathy indicated, those have ended up actually even being formal enforcement.
And I put CWC in the chat as Central Waste Complex, but I can't remember what RAP is.
Oh, waste.
Waste receiving and packaging.
Yeah, there you
go. So what we were wondering, do inspectors ever go places where you all need to wear PPE?
Well, we could do that. Go ahead.
So yeah, we have there's different levels of PPE, and you know, we do a safety plan before we go out to do any inspection. And Hanford's a very safe place. You know, when we go, every inspection that we go, they do a safety briefing before we go out to each and every facility. And so there's different levels of PPE. Like you have boots, you have a safety vest, you have hard hat, you have earplugs, you have safety glasses. Those are like the common level D level, but the higher levels, you know, with full face respirator and access into like tank farms, you know, I'll let John speak to that.
Yeah, well, we've generally found that we can get our inspections done without putting on a lot of PPE. So, you know, we tend to do that. So we've really not suited up, you know, in my recent memory, more than 20 years, I think.
Well, the reason for that is we're not the first responders. And we don't have that robust training and everything to be first responders. I mean, you know, we do what we can, but yet, safety is number one for our staff. And we work with the first responders, or we're there, but in our role as regulator.
Awesome. Thanks, Kathy. Thanks, Jared. And thanks, John. So we have a question on Zoom, and I might be able to preface this question by saying I have a link to one of our ecology web pages I'm going to share in the chat that talks about a leak detection process. But I'll go ahead and ask the question, and John, if you have anything you want to elaborate on, or if that's a topic that we should defer to one of our other staff offline, just let me know. But the question was, why does it take so long for tanks to be reported? What actions do ecology take when this does not happen? And that comes from Rose.
Yeah, and Jared really is the expert here on the leak detection and monitoring document for the single shell tanks, but that's probably a better discussion outside of this forum. But there is kind of a process that DOE goes through. It can be pretty lengthy to evaluate the information and make a determination that there has been a leak. And so there's, in the past with some of these tanks, there's been a lot of back and forth between ecology and DOE over evaluating whether or not a tank is leaking. And do you want to add anything to that, Jared?
Well, I'll add that I know in the in my compliance role, and since we go out there, we inspect everything, that I get tank leak reported quite readily. They have the forms and a process, and I've received a leak or a notice of a leak. I don't know how long Rosie's talking about, but Jared, you can chime in too.
So the leak detection process is handled at the project manager level for the tanks, and so a lot of that is done through project manager meetings, and there's discussions monthly where they talk about evaluation trends and data, and that's done at the project. At the compliance level, we go out, we're making sure that they're doing the number of level detections, they're documenting that and how they do that. So in the tanks, there's what's called an NRAF. It's a device that's used in the petroleum industry. It drops a weight into it, and it's for tanks that have liquid surfaces, and it's very precise. But there's also tanks like single shell tanks that have, there's no liquid surface. It's a solid surface because they did interim stabilization where they pumped up all the pumpable liquids out of the SSTs and retrieved them to the DSTs. And so then when you have a solid surface, they have what's called a liquid observation well, and then they put a neutron probe into the dry well, and then they're able to know where that level is within the sludge or salt cake that's within the tank. And sometimes that's not as accurate as a process because it has to get sent off. They have to do an analysis on it and do a lot of, and there's some, there's bands of air in there. And there's lots of things that change with what's called interstitial liquid within that salt cake or sludge that makes it very difficult to determine kind of what's going on. Sometimes there's air displacement in tanks, and that's what the project works with and they discuss in monthly meetings.
Everybody, we have a question from Jerry Paulette in the chat, but I also see that another Jerry Yorioka has his camera on. Jerry, did you have a question that you wanted to ask him?
Well, I mean, my question was very similar to Rose's. It took 2 years from the monitoring data that showed a precipitous drop beyond the Energy Department's own criteria for what qualified as a leak in tank B109 before they filed a leak report. And isn't the point of compliance to enable the public and the regulator to know about a leak and respond immediately, rather than energy spending 2 years having its own internal meetings with people saying, let's find a reason to say it's not a leak, which is what happened. you know, I'm a little befuddled by the answer right now because the evidence is very clear that 2 years went by before the notice was provided that there was a leak. And Rose asked the question that also relates, which I've asked before, which is why wasn't the leak from B109 detected and investigated when Ecology did an inspection of the B tank farm?
John, you're muted.
I'm on mute. Yeah, okay. Yeah, so the types of things our inspectors will be looking at is some of what Jared referred to. So there is monitoring equipment. So we're going to be looking at things like, is the monitoring equipment operated, being checked to make sure it's operating correctly? That's the kind of thing that we're providing through compliance inspections to make sure that there is good quality data generated. As Jared mentioned, when that data is generated, it's really discussed in the tri-party agreement project manager meetings rather than kind of coming up as a compliance violation.
Thanks for your question, Jerry and Rose. And again, I do see another Jerry Yorioka. I pronounced your name right. I see your camera's on. Did you have a question that you wanted to ask live, or it's okay if you don't? I just saw your camera that came on a little bit ago. All right, don't see that. Okay, Ginger, did we have another pre-submitted question that you wanted to ask?
Yeah. What is the largest penalty we've ever issued? And it's a two-part one. And where does the money go when there's a penalty issued?
Yeah, I can answer that. So the largest penalty we ever issued was $1,065,000, and we issued that as a tri-party agreement penalty, and it had to do with timely access to information, basically. That penalty got appealed to the Washington Pollution Control Hearing Board. They recently reduced that penalty by half, and that penalty situation is still in a time period where it could be appealed further. So I think that answers the question. Oh, where does the money go? So the money goes into the Model Toxics Control operating account.
Alrighty, I am looking at both of our screens here. Not seeing Facebook questions. Not seeing any further Zoom questions. Does anybody have any other questions they want to put into the chat? Or Ginger, do you have any other questions that were pre-submitted while we're waiting to see for the question?
This is Kathy. Did we fully answer Rose's question where she's wanting to know would not the B109 have been detected on a yearly inspection? I don't know if we answered that or not for her, but
I think I did, because I made, and also Ryan posted some information. He posted a link in the chat about leak detection process. So I think there's a more detailed answer at that link.
okay, thanks.
There was one last question. Oh, that's a good question. How much penalties have DOE paid totally? You might have to go do the math for that, but before you try and calculate that, John, is there one area that is a common issue that you guys end up having to do enforcement on, or like you've done the similar enforcements on similar issues more than once?
Yeah, maybe Jared can answer that. And maybe you can talk a little bit about what are indicator violations, just to prompt you. I don't know what's the best answer there.
So yeah, there's so the compliance things, they really do change. Inspectors will change the focus on different things on different inspections, and so it's kind of depending on what they're looking at. So it can go, there's all different parts and pieces that we have to look at and what's required in the inspection. And so we look at training, you look at contingency planning, you look at the facilities inspections of themselves. But there's what's called an indicator violations, and those are things that we have to follow up. Those are things like improper container management, failure to designate, the indicator violations where when we do inspections, we follow up on those.
Yeah, and I think you're right on, Ginger. I don't believe that I can quickly total up how much total penalties the Department of Energy has paid over the years. It's really kind of I'm not sure I can even get to all those numbers because some of the penalties go back as far as 1986, and some of them were issued under our Hazardous Waste Management Act authority, and I've had to comb through records to find those. And others were issued through the tri-party agreement, which are a little bit easier to find. I think I've got all those on one slide, but certainly in the low millions of dollars, I would guess.
So Glenna asked, after listening here, I'm concerned that there's not an adequate process for addressing dangerous leaks quickly. Does anyone on the panel share the concern? And you guys could put a thumbs up in the chat, or no, you're not worried if you wanted to. And you know, it's good for us to know if people think that the process doesn't seem like an adequate process. Although if we're doing what the law says we need to do, I don't know that we can be any more I don't know what the word would be.
Yeah, I think I'd like to defer that question. That Department of Ecology is in active discussion with the Department of Energy right now over the response to tank B-109 and tank T-111. So I'd like to let that discussion finish out.
Thanks, John.
Yeah, and I'm just going to add one little thing, you know, in not in defense of DOE per se, but there are places where we have struggled, or they have struggled, to find the appropriate technologies to answer some of the questions that we wish we could get better and quicker answers to. And you know, like one of those was actually the vapor monitoring, and so they created a truck that could do real-time vapor monitoring, but then they got so many data points, because before it was like a delay. They'd get an alarm, but then they wouldn't get the results back from the lab for several weeks or months, if I recall. And now they got the truck, and when they first got the truck, they'd get like 300 data points, and that wasn't very helpful either. So they had to, you know, work and refine it.
Thanks, everybody. I'm not seeing any more questions on Facebook. I'm not seeing any more on Zoom. We'll go ahead and do a last call for questions. If anybody has any more questions, feel free to stick in the chat. But while we're waiting, if anybody sorry, can't talk today. If anybody has any last minute questions, feel free to put them into the chat. I'll remind folks that we're going to be putting this on YouTube tomorrow, so you can rewatch it if you want. We'll be sharing the slides on our website, and we'll be posting on social media. Of course, if you actually go on Facebook after this event, but it's going to buffer and it'll be available probably within 30 minutes if you want to rewatch it right away. All that being said, I am still not seeing any other questions in the chat boxes, so I'll go ahead and turn it over to Ginger to start closing us out. You're muted, Ginger. Ginger, you're muted.
It's weird when we go to the slide, my stuff drops below my my taskbar and I can't see it. Anyway, thank you so much for joining us tonight. And please do reach out to us if you have any further questions at the email address here, hanford@ecy.wa.gov. Follow us on Facebook if you use Facebook, or Twitter at ECY Hanford. And we hope that you will join us for future conversations. And also, all of our past videos are on our ecology YouTube page, so you can find prior episodes if you missed anything and would like to go back and watch later.
Awesome, thanks, Ginger, and John, Jared, Kathy. You guys have any parting thoughts before we call it a night?
No, I appreciate everybody taking, I guess I do, I appreciate everybody taking the interest in the Hanford cleanup. You know, it takes a lot of public interest to keep cleanup moving forward. So, you know, I appreciate the continued support.
Yeah, and this is Kathy, I just wanted to say, I put it in the chat that a final status permit is going to be the best way to resolve a lot of these issues. And and I'm sure all of you wonder why it's taking so long, and I wonder that too. And it is a high priority for our program. And if compliance will have a complete final status permit, our job will be better and easier. So just remember, the permit is the key.
Awesome. Thanks, Kathy.
All right.
And so on that final, I just had one more thought I was going to share, that if anybody has any topics that they want to see in the future, let's talk about Hanford. Feel free to pitch it to us at hanford@ecy.wa.gov. Again, that's hanford@ecy.wa.gov, or to shoot us a message on our Facebook or social or Twitter. And we look forward to doing another one of these here in the next couple of months. But thank you everybody for joining, and have a fantastic night.
Bye, everyone.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Really enjoyed it.